Welcome to another episode of the We Have a Meeting podcast. Today we're joined by an incredible guest, voted as one of the top voices in HR, a psychologist and a man on a mission in the wellbeing space, looking to empower and turbocharge wellbeing leaders and the entire workforce. Today we've got Matt Smeed. Matt, how are you?
Yeah, I'm brilliant, thank you. Yeah, better after that introduction.
Yeah. I'll give it you as your alarm in the morning. So we always start our podcast off the same way. It's a nice big broad question. Who are you and what problem do you solve?
Okay, yeah, I can answer that. So my name's Matt. I am a business psychologist by trade. So loads of different organisations with a real interest in people. That's the broadest look at it. So it's always been that focus on people, specialised for probably about 15, 16 years. God, the years go by, in employee wellbeing. So that's been the area that I've always had a real passion for and an interest in. But in terms of what I'm doing now to help people, or hopefully helping people, I am the co-founder of something called the Working Well community. So the Working Well community brings together wellbeing leaders from all sorts of different organisations around the globe. Essentially, it's mostly UK based at the moment, although we're looking to grow. And it's about empowering them, upskilling them, connecting them together so we can, as much as anything, like legitimize this role of wellbeing leader, which is still in its infancy, even probably a couple of decades old, having, roles specifically targeted at wellbeing, but still in its relative infancy. So yeah.
Okay.
That's what I do.
There's a really obvious question that I've always wanted to know.
Go on.
Psychologist to business psychologist. What is the main difference between the two?
Yeah, the difference is probably they're proper psychologists, whereas I just pretend no. So I guess when people think psychologist, they probably, the first thing your brain jumps to is the more clinical side. So, therapy, counselling, mental health, these sorts of things, based in a medical setting. Now, a business psychologist, we probably set out on the same sort of pathway in the sense that both did undergraduate psychology degrees, but I had more of an interest in terms of how people operate in the workplace and the effect that the workplace has on people. So in terms of the work that I do, I would probably stop short. No, I shouldn't say probably. I would definitely stop short of giving people clinical advice because I am not qualified to give people clinical psychological advice. However, what I'm interested in is the effect that workplace pressure has on people. It gets into the realms of physical and mental health as well, but the difference being, it's not in a medical setting. It's not kind of overstepping the line. I'm not a therapist as such, although some of my coaching conversations aren't far off. Is that a clear enough definition? I'd never really thought about that. Yeah, and probably they've done a lot more studying than I have. And clinical psychology takes a few more years than work psychology. So maybe the biggest difference is I'm slightly lazier than a proper psychologist.
I like it. I like that we got to that conclusion.
Yeah,
I think it was interesting that you were talking about, obviously, like a couple of your coaching sessions feel like therapy sessions, because me and Zach are big advocates that sales is quite therapeutic. So could you give us maybe a couple of examples? Why would you say they're therapeutic? What style do they take?
Well, in the sense that my understanding of therapy, counselling, coaching, all of these things is essentially, in 5 seconds, ask loads of questions and listen more. And as human beings, we don't do that very well, right? We're good at giving our advice and our 2 pence and being on podcasts and telling everyone else what they should think. But instead, coaching and therapy, for that matter, is more about helping the other individual to find stuff out. I guess the difference being that when it comes to therapy, there's probably a bit of a harder edge when it comes to you talking about that person's actual health and well-being, perhaps. But when you're talking coaching, it's a similar sort of thing. The answers that the person requires are within them already, and it is your job as a coach to try to bring them out by asking the right question at the right time and giving them space to verbalize some of the things that they're thinking. Plus the fact that I made the joke about they're not far off a therapy session, because essentially once you get people on one-to-one, as you will know I know you do some coaching yourselves, right? When you get people on one-to-one, they'll tell you all sorts of things that they wouldn't necessarily, especially if it's in that setting. And especially if you call yourself a psychologist, by the way. Even if it's got work psychologist. Do you know what? I know this wasn't what the podcast was for, but I got a flight back. This is a couple of years ago now, pre-pandemic. So I got a flight back from Dubai. I was doing some work out there. And there's a lady sat next to me on the flight home, 7-hour flight. And she said, "Oh, what do you do?" And I said, "Oh, I'm a work psychologist." So she said, "Oh, that's interesting." Anyway, for the next 7 hours, she told me about how her marriage was breaking down. What should she do? How could she sustain future relationships? And despite the fact for the entire 7 hours, I was like, that's not the type of psychologist I am. She still just kept telling me these things. So yeah, maybe it's something about the title that brings that out, perhaps. I don't know.
Maybe the title and the voice. You're quite therapeutic. I feel like I want to tell you all my deepest, darkest secrets.
You can if you want, yeah.
But we'll take it offline.
Yeah. We'll take that offline. Yeah.
Okay, good stuff. So you said earlier about the wellbeing roles that they've kind of existed for the last couple of decades, but obviously it's more prominent now. So why are they rising? What are some of the indicators as to why wellbeing and wellness in the workplace is being taken more seriously?
That's a good question. It's probably just had I ever thought about why there's more coming? I guess I'm so bought into the fact that organizations, it's a no-brainer that they should be investing in employee well-being, because I'd see well-being and productivity and profit and all those things as like inextricably linked, right? You know, it just makes sense to me that if your people are healthy and happy, they will be more productive, they will be better at their jobs, they'll be more connected to one another, they'll sell more, whatever it may be. So I feel like the business case is very sound. In terms of why that's actually changing, maybe that's organizations actually taking that business case more seriously. Maybe it's them looking for competitive advantage over, within the market. Say, we've maximized all we can do in terms of our brand efficacy and all sorts of different other areas. So what can we do to just be the best place to work, perhaps? I tell you, another one is generationally, how it's changed as well. People expect, I don't know about you, but people expect something different from work these days. You start out in your career, well, that's a whole other thing, like whether or not you have a career that is as linear as previous, probably not. But I don't know, you expect certainly not to be put at harm by the work that you do. And I mean psychologically as well as physically. But then more than that, I feel like, I don't know, I feel like especially post-pandemic, the relationships change. Like I expect a bit more back from my employer. And I know that there are stats that show these days that people will, when you're looking for a job role, they'll look at whether an organisation has provision for employee well-being and these sorts of things, as much as they'll look for salary and all that sort of... when I started 15 years ago, you essentially just looked at the salary. Like, does this have good salary opportunities and good opportunities for development? That was more the focus. Whereas I believe nowadays it's more, will I actually be looked after? And what provision is there for my well-being in this? Because people are in society taking things like mental health much more seriously. So, probably one of them.
There's it's going to feel like a loaded question, this, but it comes from experience of something we did where we worked with it was like a well-being software, so people could let their employer know anonymously that they were struggling with mental health or something like that. And I thought when the client got in touch, this is going to be great. Everyone's going to be interested in this. Yeah. And your generational point was quite interesting, that the newer, like a big marketing agency that's got a lot of young people might be invested in that. But I was quite shocked at the other extreme in logistics or construction or something like that. People really are still in that man up, I don't care, I think it's a load of rubbish type thing. Do you spot that people people have more of an understanding in certain industries, or is that just bad experience on our part?
There are industry differences. There definitely are. I don't want to necessarily drag any particular industries that I've worked in. Different industries face different challenges, right? So one thing I would say is that, and this is, I said I wasn't going to slag off an industry, and now I'm going to slag them all off. Every industry thinks they're unique. Like you've never worked in legal, you've never worked in construction, you don't know what it's like, and it's like it's the same because you've got human beings interacting with one another. Largely, there are other pressures. So anyway, where was I going with that? I was going to say, like, the pressures are slightly different based on the industries. I think the route into this stuff is different. So you probably end up in the same place, but the route in is slightly different. So if you use the example that you just said, stereotypically, an advertising agency or something like this, young demographic workforce, this sort of thing, maybe they are just more tuned in to things like positive psychological well-being and, having good days at work and that sort of thing as being a precursor to performance. So that's their route into it, and talking about mental health. Construction firms, though, I think you said construction, they'd surprise you. Industries like that, whilst, yes, there is some of that macho culture, and I'm not just going to dive straight in and start telling you about my childhood necessarily. These industries for very many years have been very safety focused, right? In a way that your agencies haven't been. So they are very focused on how do we keep people from having accidents and fatalities in the workplace, and they have rules and they have procedures, and they take it very seriously. Some people roll their eyes at health and safety, but they take it seriously because there is a legitimate risk there. And what I've seen recently within a number of construction firms that I've worked with is that by tagging or by trying to bring some parity between psychological and physical health and safety and well-being, that's the route in for a lot of those organizations. So yeah, I'm maybe not going to just start, I don't want to dive straight into a therapy session, but I know I need to keep myself safe and well at work because I'm working with heavy machinery or dangerous chemicals. And part of that is how fatigued am I psychologically? What are my psychosocial risks? Do I have a good relationship with my manager? And I won't get too boring into it, but there's a new standard, ISO 45003, which is you heard of ISO standards? Yeah. So maybe. So these ISO standards that exist, it's like the legalities of how you manage all sorts of different things. Like, data security has an ISO standard and health and safety has one. 45003, launched last year, is the more psychological well-being standard, if I was going to put it in layman's terms. And really interestingly, the organizations that are going for that tend to be in those more like construction industry or the more, I guess, like macho culture industry that are very safety focused, if you see what I mean. So maybe that's the route in it for them. But there are some differences. And I guess the challenge for us is how we, as an industry, and this is where I feel working well can help, how we empower those well-being leaders to tell the right story based on the industry that they're working in, because you want to get everybody involved, right? You don't just want the early adopters who are interested in this stuff. You want to get everyone involved and believing like it matters, essentially.
So some great points there. And my mind went when you said that you could be dealing with law and they're saying you've never dealt with law before, it's totally different, or another industry and it's actually we're all the same because we're all dealing with human beings. Does that mean that the symptoms of needing to do something about well-being are the same? If I was like a business owner or HR director or something, how do I notice that there's something that needs to be done or changed?
Yeah, probably pretty similar. Obviously, to just tag on to that safety culture that we talked about before, it might actually lead to an increase in like serious incidents and fatalities, much less likely to happen in a advertising agency. But across all organizations, you'd see, I don't know, like strained relationships. You kind of feel it in the culture in terms of how people are operating and talking to one another. But then, yeah, I'm big into data as well. So if you're collecting any data about employee engagement and well-being and this sort of thing, you'd see a slip in subjective well-being measures. But I'll tell you another big one is retention. And that's obviously a big challenge for organizations at the moment. How do we keep our best people, retain our best people? And people do not stay in organizations where they are treated badly unless they're trapped. Interestingly, you do see, it was interesting, because I'm old enough to have worked through the banking crisis. When was that? Kind of 2008, 2009, but also the pandemic. And during that period, people's job insecurity goes right up, right? So that's one of the things that could contribute to you having negative levels of well-being. But the problem is it kind of traps you, because that as a pressure, you think, I'm really stressed by the fact that my job is insecure, but the last thing I'm going to do is look for another job because I'm insecure about my job, right? So I'm going to kind of stay where I am. But as soon as that pressure is relieved somewhat, so come out of the pandemic, come out of the banking crisis, you'll find out which organizations have been looking after their staff, because the ones who haven't, they're all just going to head straight for the door, right, when the market opens up. So it's, I think retention, sickness absence as well, but retention's probably the big one for me.
So would you say for any business leaders listening to this, like if they're listening to this and they've thought, oh my God, we've not done enough, I'm worried, like there's a few radars are kind of going off, where should they go and look straight away? Like you're talking about the data, like where would be the first place to start, and what would be, I guess, the first thing to lay down to try and solve these problems?
Yeah, that's interesting. So if it were me, I would start to collect some data as early as I possibly could. One of the things that businesses often do is they look for solutions too quickly, right? So there are a myriad well-being providers out there who can offer you apps and meditation and yoga sessions and the list is endless, and some better than others, granted, but regardless of how good their offering is, if it doesn't fit with your culture and if it's not actually solving a problem that you have, it's not going to land very well. So actually the first thing I'd do would be to collect some data, and by collect some data I mean you might run a survey and find out what's pressuring people and build off the back of that. You might benchmark or scorecard some of the existing data that you've got, like your retention figures, your sickness absence levels, if you measure profitability and productivity, to look for areas of the business where perhaps it's not as high as it should be, and well-being may be one reason for that. But the other type of data is just speaking to people, right? I'd talk to people and ask them questions about their experience of working in the organisation. So you're getting a really good understanding of where are people at in terms of their own well-being, stress, whatever you want to call it, and what do they potentially need. And then you can start thinking, right, how do we solve that problem? And then even when you're going on to the solving the problem, I would try and solve it with the employees themselves. So I'm a big fan of something called co-creation, which is rather than a business leader sitting in a dark room and working out, like I say, which yoga course the staff need, it's about talking to them about, right, if we've got a budget for this, how would we best spend it, right? How would we best spend it and bring benefit to you as a workforce? So that's probably where I'd start with some of this. I wouldn't dive straight into trying to solve problems, because you end up ticking boxes.
That's interesting, and it probably leads on quite nicely to my next point. From conversations I've had with other business leaders and friends in this, they find that they find a solution that suits, and then after a while, whatever that solution is, it tends to tail off. So how do you get that long-term commitment from people to people who are excited to start with, like any new product or service that comes in? It's like, well, let's solve this problem. Then eventually over time, it's like, oh, that actually feels like a bit of a chore to actually focus on our own well-being. So how do you entice that long-term commitment from employees?
Yeah, so that's part of creating. So when I talk about well-being, I don't think it's synonymous with some of the things that people typically think of, like your yoga sessions and your mindfulness apps and this sort of thing. Look, I've got no problem with those, and actually I think that organisations should be doing all they can to promote positive health and well-being, and there will be people in your organisations who want to access that sort of stuff, like you say, whether they access it more at the start and it tails off perhaps, maybe. But actually, when I define well-being, I'm also talking about what are the quality of the relationships in your organization? Do people have autonomy in their roles? What are they balancing their workload effectively and managing a good work-life balance? Do they feel they're paid fairly and equitably? If you can get those things right, that's what creates positive well-being, more than yoga and all the rest of it. So when you're talking about some of these things tailing off, you're probably talking about the mindfulness app, which is very popular at the start, but then tails off. If you were talking about well-being being, we're going to pay people fairly and equitably, we're going to give them some ownership over how they define their roles and balance their own workload, I would suggest that wouldn't tail off quite as quickly, because people would always take that seriously, right? So what you're actually trying to do is, rather than seeing well-being as the sprinkles on top of the cake, you're saying, how do I bake it into the way that we work? So it's not a case of it tailing off. It's not an added extra. Well-being just becomes part of everything we do. and this is where where it changes kind of organization to organization, right? Because it'll be based on like whether a sales professional or a health professional or whatever it might be, but what are the fundamental aspects of their jobs and how do we bring well-being into it? Is my kind of systemic view of it. It's a bit of a complicated answer. I wish I could, or just give them incentives, right? Yeah, just give them some cake. Give them some actual cake, and they'll keep using it. No, don't use that answer.
There was loads of interesting bits there. So I'm interested in this co-creation piece.
Yeah.
So this, let's play devil's advocate, right? So let's say I'm a business that's been around for 20, 30 years. We've done it more as a dictatorship with senior leaders telling the rest of the business what to do. How would I start to ask myself questions around if that's something that I should be putting in place if I'm one of those senior leaders in a big business? What challenges should I be bringing up to myself?
Wow. Well, the real question is how many people actually do that. Because I'll be honest with you, the frustration is, I mean, that's probably the most difficult part of my job, is shifting that sort of behaviour. Yeah, it's worked before. This has worked for the last 20 years, so why don't we just keep doing it, right? And this whole industry, I mean, I said I wasn't going to pick on any particular industry, but I was thinking about the legal industry earlier this morning because of a client I was working with, and that, again, stereotypically is very high pressure, quite male dominated in senior positions, that macho culture that I talked about before. Trying to genuinely get some of those senior leaders to take this stuff seriously and not see it as soft and fluffy and just the added extra that makes it a nice place to work is difficult. I think your suggestions sound. I think trying to tell them a story about why it matters to them as individual leaders. And when you scratch below, the joke is, when you scratch below the surface, even these, alpha dictatorial leaders, you get them one-on-one and you do a coaching session with them and you ask them some of these questions and they got all the same problems that everyone else does, right? They just hide it well. They've got their own mental health, they've got families, they've got stress, they've got poor sleep, all this sort of stuff. So probably it's about trying to bring some vulnerability out in those individuals, because again, I genuinely believe, and it won't definitely work in every circumstance, but a bit more vulnerability from leadership and a bit will create something called psychological safety. And psychological safety is, it bleeds down into an organization whereby I feel, even at the bottom line, even at the front line, of an organization, I'm able to bring my whole self to work and talk openly and honestly about how I feel and this sort of thing. And you only create a culture of that if it comes from the top. But that's probably the hardest thing. It's trying to shift that behaviour. Yeah, you got any ideas?
I see some signs of some frustration there when this one came up. So
look, I'll be honest with you. I love what I do, but there are moments of existential crisis where I'm sat in a room full of execs and around a board table talking about well-being, and they just don't get it. They just completely do not get it. No matter how many times I talk about psychosocial risk and ISO standards and trying to legitimize this whole field. It's, but we've got a Headspace app. Well, that's enough. It's like, that's not what I mean. That's not what I mean. That's part of it, but it's not the whole thing. So there are some frustrations. But that's the whole point. So I'm actually feel like my whole new mission really is that I feel I could do as much, hopefully more good, by upskilling and empowering the individuals who already work in these organizations, these wellbeing leaders, to make a difference within their own organizations, rather than me coming in from external and telling them what they should change. Because you'll know, as a, I don't know, what you call as like external organization, supplier organization, they can pick you up and drop you quickly, so they'll say, oh, let's do a long-term project together, but the budget runs out, or the motivation runs out, and you leave. And it's easy to do. Not that I'm complaining about it, because I know that's how it works. But the risk is that you've lost quite a lot of good work that you've done along the way. But by upskilling, leaders within these organisations, they're still there. I mean, obviously they could leave as well, but hopefully you're upskilling a few more.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
And they can go on to another organisation and do the same thing there.
Make those better. Yeah,
hopefully. Exactly. So it sounded then like the biggest objection in your world, and it's not uncommon, is change, getting people to change.
Yeah. Well, as a psychologist, that's it, right? It's just everything comes down to behaviour change. Pretty much. Yeah.
But that's the frustrating one, because that one for us as salespeople tends not to show itself quite as obviously. People can hide reluctance to change around budgets and the timeline doesn't quite work what we're doing now. They don't say we don't want to change as openly as they would say those other things.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, because I hear the same sorts of things, right? I hear the same sorts of things and as well, I guess it'll be similar with you. If there's no burning platform, so if you worked with an organization where they weren't selling anything and they were going to go out of business in 6 months if they didn't, well, then they would listen to you and they would take it very seriously. But if it's just because they want to add an extra 10% to the bottom line, it's important, but there's no burning platform, if you see what I mean. So it's how do you convince those organizations to change where it's not it's not essential, I guess. I can't believe I'm saying that. But, organizations, they don't have to invest in well-being if they don't want to. I mean, look, I think given 20, maybe 10, 20, 30 years from now, they'd regret it badly because their brand would be so damaged compared to other organizations who do take it seriously, that it might even put them out of business. But I guess then you've got to find new ways to encourage them to change, right? You
sounded conflicted there, Matt. So I guess if you had to answer honestly from your point, well-being in the workplace, is it a need or is it a want?
So I think it's a need. So I think it's only a want at the moment because there are other organisations who don't take it seriously as well, right? So if 99% of organisations were taking well-being incredibly seriously and you were the 1% who weren't, you would go out of business. And there are some really interesting studies recently that have shown the link between firm performance and employee well-being. So there's one, again, without getting too much into it, Oxford University study. I can't believe it's not got more airtime than it has, probably because it's a journal article and only weirdos like me read them. But they did a really interesting study with Indeed.com. You'll know that. It's a big recruiter from the US. They've got big data set. And they looked at stock price. So they said if you invested $1,000 into the stocks and shares of the top 10% in the S&P 500 in terms of employee well-being, you would have got $1,300 back in a 12-month period, right? If you just done it on a general index, you'll have only got $1,100 back. So you would have made significantly more money by investing in organizations that care about well-being. I guess back to your original question but the index would get you $1,100 back. So I need the index to be giving you like $900 back, right? I need it to be going in the other direction if they don't care about well-being, and that's not quite happened yet. But look, I feel like there will be like a critical mass at some point where it tips over into need. So the longest answer to your question ever, sorry. I'll keep them shorter.
I like it.
But I think at the moment it probably is a mix of want and need, but I feel like the dial's getting further and further towards, we just need to do this. And I don't know when that tipping point will be. I'll be honest, I thought it'd be slightly sooner than now. When I first started, I went to conferences 15 years ago where they were like, well-being's finally going to get onto the senior leader agenda. And then I went to one last year and they were like, well-being's finally going to get on the agenda. What? Yeah, but I feel like there has been huge progress made and it continues to be made as well. Yeah,
and it does feel like we're moving in the right direction. I think the more that happens eventually, it might be a necessity and people have to kind of take hold of it and quash it. So I guess, I don't know how much you want to give away at this point, Matt, but say you were sat down and I was one of those leaders and I said, you know what, I want to change, I'm open, I'm ready for it. And you were to hand me a blueprint and it was a blueprint that would solve all of my problems. What are the top 3 things on that blueprint that I should be doing?
Right. So I wouldn't hand you a blueprint. I would say, I would say back to the co-creation point. I would say, Larry, look, I'm a big advocate of something called design thinking. So design thinking, they use it a lot in the tech industry. You may have come across this, human-centered design thinking. It says any problem has a solution, even the really difficult problems, the really complex problems. And I would put well-being into that category, and stress into that category. But the solution to that problem lies with the individuals who are faced by the challenge itself, right? And the individuals are the employees within an organization. So if I was working with a leader, again, I would say, how do we have proper conversations with people all across your business about, honestly, what are some of the pressures that they're facing? How concerned are they by these different factors? What impact is it having in terms of how they're working? Being honest with some of the data that we're collecting and correlating it and collating it in a way that's shed some insight into how people are thinking and feeling and operating. And then I would say, let's work with them to create some potential solution to make the workplace better, right? Because that's all you want to do. You're just trying to make it a better place to work for everyone. You spend 90,000 hours at work apparently in your lifetime, so you want to make those 90,000 hours like decent and worth doing. So I guess I've dodged the question there a little bit, but I would say to the senior leader, right, let's get out and speak to people and listen and co-create some things. But I would also encourage them to be vulnerable as well, like for them to bring some of their own stories to the table, to start talking about employee well-being in a way that's, like I say, that can become cultural over time, I guess.
And we had someone on last week who's she wrote a book. Actually, I've got the book here. Free plug for her. Thrive with a Hybrid Workplace by Julie Cantor, who's a business psychologist in the States. And we don't have a hybrid working model because I just don't know how that could possibly work for a sales team. Am I wrong to not embrace that as the way things are moving?
So what stops you? Why wouldn't it work in a sales context?
There's a few things. I think there's like a cultural element of the buzz of a sales floor and people, because you're having to deal with very tribal things of rejection and validation. Probably on every call, I'm going to get a lot of rejection. I'm going to find it quite reassuring to look across the room and see someone else in the same boat as me, and we kind of pick each other up and things like that. But then there's also probably an element of it's a bit of a brutal job, and if someone's not sat there to sort of steer you and spot you, maybe coming up against some hurdles, and the feedback loop's not immediate, is it going to make you less efficient and more likely to just procrastinate a bit more? Yeah. So that's what stops me.
Okay. Yeah. So it sounds like, I don't know you, Zach, but it sounds like maybe there's a trust thing there in terms of, do you trust people if they were working from home to be working as hard as you'd like them to be?
Maybe not.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, maybe not. But then only because I just less so like a trust thing, more so of a sales is a brutal job, and if I could put off that rejection loop for half an hour longer and go and make myself a really long cup of tea or something, I'd probably be more likely to do that at home than in the office.
Yeah. So it's not like I don't trust that person there, but it's more like I don't trust myself. I don't trust myself
exactly. And I know I know what human beings like. When I started this business off, it had to work because it was just me in my bedroom, and I had like kids downstairs and mortgage to pay and stuff. So the why was very secure, and it got me out of bed in the morning quite easily. But I wouldn't expect that from someone who's 23.
Yeah, I've got you. I read. Have you got 4 kids as well?
Yeah, 4 kids.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, no wonder you're getting psychologists on your podcast.
What's wrong with me?
No, you're brave. Anyway, so it's an interesting look. I think back to your original question. I don't know. What have you tried it? What would stop you Have you tried it? Have you trialed any kind of hybrid working, remote working, and found that it didn't work, or is this just based on an inkling, or is it that you don't want to open Pandora's box?
These are good challenging questions. See, this is why people should hire you. We've had it where people couldn't make it in, and then it's been like a case of I'll work from home today. Yeah. Probably more so in your office, Jack, than mine. I don't know how well that works, if you had to be honest about it.
I think from the feedback I've had, I think it's a real community in that there's like we celebrate the wins, but not too much because we're big on that. But like if we're sales, we're called We Have a Meeting. We book meetings for people. So like we've got to say that there is something in that, like celebrating those wins, and also after those rejections, it's very easy to say, look, let's go and sit on the roof for 10 minutes. And maybe it might not be the best place to take someone after a rejection, but it's a case of like, let's go outside, let's get some fresh air, let's talk about it, remember, let's be stoic, and then it's being in that moment. And yeah, you are right. It can be easy to do that from home, Zoom, but from that conversation we'll talk about hybrid working. I think that leadership sense of just being in the room and be like, good morning, how are we all? You kind of lose some of that. And it's not to say like a hybrid working model. Who knows? We're still very small. We're still less than 15. So you never know. But I'm dubious as well. But by the end of this conversation, Matt, you might change my mind.
I'm with you. And to be honest, so the research that I'm aware of, and again, your previous guest, I'm sure, knows a lot more about this than I do. But the research that I'm aware of tends to say that flexible working can have very positive impacts on employee well-being and therefore employee productivity, right? So you get more from people if they're able to work flexibly. The one thing that I'd add to that, though, is that it's more about autonomy. So it's more about them making the decision to be able to do that. So, and actually, if I was working in a sales environment that you're talking about there, I may well come to the conclusion that, no, do you know what? I much prefer to be with people because I get this all the time, right? You know, one of the big things that people lost during the pandemic was that ability. I've just had a really hard phone call and I put the phone down, you know, maybe it's a rejection, or I've talked to people, you know, like carers and this sort of thing, like really brutal phone calls that they're having, quite emotional phone calls. I just want to be able to put the phone down, turn to the person next to me and go, oh, fucking hell. Like, that was really hard. And I don't have that anymore. You know, I can turn to the dog, but it just looks at me blankly. You know, that's all that I've got. So I may well come to the conclusion that, do you know what, given the types of pressures that I'm under, I am at my best primarily based in an office. You might have someone else, though. You know, maybe you've got someone working for you or in that sort of industry where, you know, the flexibility of being able to, you know, pick the kids up or something would just take such a stress off their week that perhaps that would allow them to be much more productive in the times that they do work. So it's probably quite an individual thing. It's probably about trying it out. I guess the risk is the Pandora's box thing that I was talking about before. So you'd probably want to frame it as, you know, this is an experiment sort of thing, right? But there's loads of examples of things that don't make, like they don't seem to make, what's the word, like, you know, sense to us. Like the 4-day working week. You look at the 4-day working week and you think that can't possibly leave people as productive because you're losing a day. But they've done trials and random control experiments and all the rest of it, and it seems to show that over time, yeah, people are more productive because they actually get more done. It's not true of everybody. But, you know, if you look at the data and if you look at broad trends, it looks like 4-day working week isn't something that you can just say out of hand definitely won't work, right? Because in some industries, some organizations, it might really work. It might be the thing that really unlocks their growth. So again, I'm not encouraging you to move to a 4-day working week because I don't know whether that would work for you. But I guess what's the risk in asking the question and trying to find out a little bit more? I don't know. Rather than assuming that, you know, you seem to have pretty good rationale for why hybrid wouldn't work. But again, the co-creation piece is about not making those assumptions. It's about, you know, making those decisions through a process of dialogue and conversations with actual employees.
You
it does take a bit of time. You could just crack on with what you're doing.
You make some brilliant points, and like you're saying there, like you can't just take one solution and slap it on. It's not a one size fits all. So it's just sussing it out and saying like, okay, I do think like if it was a marketing role or something like that, and you can get lost in deep flow work, maybe at points, there's certain tasks that I will do in an evening or on the weekend, because I know that I'm best just switching everything off for 30 minutes, an hour, and just being on my own. If there's distractions, I'll struggle to do that because I always want to be involved with everything, and my brain's going crazy. So it's like, I think it does depend on the job at hand at points. That might be a bit of an inclination.
And depends on the individual, and depends on habits as well. I think habits are crucial to this, because the one thing you are losing, especially if you move from an office. But so the pandemic was a great experiment for this, right? Because people, like it or not, were shifted from a workplace setting to a home setting to remote working. They were like forced to do remote working, even if they hadn't planned it or wanted to. And the biggest thing that you lost was your habits. So from an individual's perspective, the commute to work and the commute home from work were just things that I did without thinking, and I was able to decompress and this sort of thing. Now I don't have that commute, so where am I getting that decompression? And I came across lots of people saying that to me. People really like working from home, but, I've had a really hard phone call and a really hard day, and then I'm switching my laptop off, and not everybody's got like a little, this isn't that fancy, but I've got an office in my house, like a little room. But some people, they're like on their dining room table, it's like close the laptop, oh, I'm at home. And it bleeds over into real life quite a lot. So I can't remember where I was going with that, but essentially, the idea being that it's the habits, isn't it? It's the habits. So they've lost those habits, so they would need a new set of habits to sustain them. And from a managerial perspective as well, you are not just going to bump into the person who's struggling that day or has just had a bad phone call and spot it in them. So you would need to more consciously make the opportunities for those catch-ups to happen. I don't think that's a reason not for not doing it. I just think it means it's a challenge, right? It just means let's create some more of these new habits that maybe work better than the previous one. Because, the last thing I would say on that is that, I've met as many people who are positive about, I was going to say positive about the pandemic, but you know what I mean, like positive about remote working as a result of the pandemic, as they were as people who were negative about it. But the whole piece is about kind of making it work for you, I guess. Again, I can't remember where I was going to go with that point. At least maybe it's because I'm working from home. I've procrastinated too much today. It'll come back to me at some point. That was a really good point I was going to make then. Yeah. Lost it. Sorry. If it comes back to you, just
there was an interesting point there. It's something that we bat around a lot, like me and Jack bat this around a lot, but the relationship between motivation and habits. So in terms of motivation sometimes feels fleeting, but if I've got a set of habits to lean on, they will tend to see me through. So I don't know if you've done any work in that space and you've got any insight on the difference between those two things.
Yeah, so I think you're spot on, right? I think that motivation, so first off, they talk about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. So extrinsic motivation is certainly more fleeting than intrinsic motivation. Extrinsic is, I'm going to do something because I'm going to get something out of it. So I'm going to, like if you're in a commission-based role, I'm going to keep selling because I'm going to get more commission, or I'm going to get a bonus, or I'm going to get this or that or the other. That does tend to be more fleeting because you'll do that all the time that you want to do it, but then you might wake up and not want to do it one day, and that happens because we're human beings. Intrinsic motivation is more you were talking about before when you started your business and you've got the kids and you had to make it work and you had your clear why. You're doing it because you've got a purpose, because you like getting better at things, these sorts of things. So I feel like that's probably a bit more long term, that type of motivation. But even in the moment, I know you had a very strong purpose, as did I when I started my business, but you're not telling me that every moment of every day you were thinking this is for the kids, right? Like there's the moment to moment motivation, and that can wane, like that can really wane, which is then where you're right, probably the habits are more important, like moment to moment, I would have thought. And it's the consistency around those things, isn't it? Again, look, he gets quite a lot of flack. The guy, Simon Sinek, you must have heard of him. So he gets quite a lot of flack because of some of the more buzzwordy things that he says. But I think some of the stuff he talks about is good. And one of the things he's big on is this idea of consistency, right? That it's the little things that you do every single day that start to mount up and make a difference long term. And if you think about someone's well-being or their performance, that's what you're talking about, right? I'm motivated to stay well and perform at a high level. But if my habits are backing that up and protecting that, that's going to make it stick. Yeah, that's going to make it stick. So then it's about how do I engineer my environment so it makes those habits happen, right? I think because if left to your own devices, again, look, I'm an inherently lazy man, so if left to my own devices, my motivation can quickly slip. But if my alarm goes off in the morning and my gym kit is just laid out on the floor and I know that I've paid for a class that I need to get to or I'll lose the money, I'll go. I'll go because it's a habit, right? I've engineered my environment to get me out of bed and get me to the gym, which I then regret. But I don't need to motivate myself essentially, because if it was a question of motivation, I am rolling over and going back to sleep.
So what are some habits, like in terms of actionable takeaways for people? What are some habits that will sustain and remain consistent, or if that's too broad, like genres of habits we should be looking at that we can probably adopt and keep? Yeah.
Okay. So when I talk about well-being related, I would say well-being is physical, psychological, social, right? So physical underpins a lot of what you do. So your levels of energy during the day. So things like, are you taking regular breaks? When are your peaks of energy during the day, and are you making the most of those or just wasting them? So for example, I meet a lot of people. You ask them, when's your peak level of energy? Well, I'm a morning person. I'm very best from 8 till 10 in the morning. That's when I'm really switched on. And then I'll either ask them, or I've actually watched them in the first couple of hours, because again, that's the type of strange thing that I do. And how do they spend the first couple of hours? Trawling through their emails, deleting spam from the day before, doing things that they could almost do in their sleep. And they've wasted that really good piece of energy that they had that first thing in the morning. They then take on a challenge that they've been putting off, or the really difficult phone call they've been putting off. But they do that just after lunch when their energy's down, something like that. And surprise, surprise, it knocks them for 6 when it doesn't go right. So it's those sorts of things. When's my natural peak of energy during the day, and how do I make the most of that? But then also, how do I actually boost energy through the day? And again, that's a very personal thing. I talk about something called active recovery. So again, geek with this, we hook people up to heart rate variability monitors. So it measures the difference in the space between the beats of your heart. And it shows you whether essentially your body is using energy, depleting it, or whether it's recharging it, kind of replenishing it. And the replenishing we call active recovery, primarily done when you're fast asleep at night, but you can do it during the day, through the use of short breaks, through exercise. And I don't mean running a marathon, but getting up and moving a little bit, right? Through connecting to someone who you really enjoy speaking to and having a bit of a laugh, or listening to some music. Again, it's a very personal thing. And also the other thing I would say is active recovery is slightly different from rest, unfortunately. So rest is, I've had a really difficult day at work, so I'm going to go home and I'm going to stick Netflix on and watch, 4 hours of Love is Blind or something like that. Giving away my Netflix. I shouldn't watch that. Anyway, but I'm going to watch 4 hours of some mindless show. You are allowed to do that, I promise you. Rest is allowed. But you don't finish that Netflix marathon thinking, I'm full of energy for the next day. Whereas had you done something like rang someone you really enjoy speaking to, doing a small amount of exercise, as long as it doesn't interfere with your sleep, these sorts of things. Even I worked with someone once, and it showed up on their heart rate variability data that they had written a novel that they were putting off. They'd been putting it off and putting it off and putting it off. They'd finally sat down and written the thing for about 2 hours in this evening, and it showed up in their heart rate data that it was replenishing their energy because they'd finally done something they really wanted to do, and they'd been procrastinating, they'd been putting off. So it's finding what works for you in terms of physical energy and building that into your day. So that'd be underpinning some of the stuff, and then you got your psychological bits as well, which kind of feeds into that.
I think that's fantastic. I love all that stuff, and I know Zach does as well. Interestingly, then you said that if to kind of play devil's advocate, if your energy usually peaks at 1, 2 in the afternoon, the whole eat the frog thing. If my frog, should I be eating my frog at 1, 2 in the afternoon if that's where I'm going to have the best of my energy, or should I just get it done first thing in the morning?
Yeah, I never know the answer to that. Okay, yeah, thanks for that question.
Sorry.
Look, if you're a morning person, you should definitely eat the frog first thing in the morning. That's without question, because not only are you getting it done first thing in the morning, but it's also your peak of energy. If you're best in the afternoon, should you leave it? I don't know. It depends how cognitively challenging it is, probably, would be my answer to that. So if it's something that requires you to be really switched on to eat the frog, then perhaps, let me leave it till 1 in the afternoon when I know that I'm on it, and that's when I'm going to do it. If it's something that you've just been putting off, which you could just do, but you don't want to do, and it's more a question of motivation rather than cognition, then maybe, just get it done the first thing in the morning, even if your energy's low, because you might actually find that's something that brings some of that active recovery, right? You might actually get a boost of energy having ticked off that horrible thing on the to-do list. So
I like it.
Yeah, there's my sit on the fence answer to that.
No, it's a very good sit on the fence answer. My dad used to say there's 97 ways to skin a frog or something like that. So no, it's a good answer.
Did it?
It's something like that.
So I think we've taken a lot of your time there. There's plenty of actionable takeaways for people. But if someone's listening to this and they're wanting to work with you closely or find out a bit more about what you can offer, where should they go? And more importantly, what kind of problems should they be experiencing that would make it worthwhile for both of you?
Yeah. They don't necessarily need to be experiencing problems. That's one of the things is, let's only look at well-being when it's become a real issue. Actually, even if your organisation's doing really well, well-being, employee well-being, that sort of thing could actually give it just an extra boost, and why not? Because it may be a good thing to do. So anyway, so look, the places to find me, I'm on LinkedIn, so if you want to contact me directly, I'm pretty active on there, so you can get in touch. I also run a business called Sisu Psychology, so if you want to find out more about the whole, like the coaching and the heart rate variability and the habits and all this sort of stuff, the work that I do directly with clients, sisupsychology.co.uk is the place to go. If you're a wellbeing leader listening to this, or if you have wellbeing leaders within your business, anyone who's responsible for wellbeing, workingwell.community. That's the community where we're getting people, we're connecting them together, we're upskilling them, we're empowering them, and we're legitimising that whole industry and that whole job title. So that's the place to go for that. Perfect.
We will put all the relevant links in the description. Thank you so much, Matt. I've really enjoyed this.
No problem. Yeah, me too. There were some hard questions. Yeah, I wasn't expecting them to be quite so hard, but yeah, thanks for that.
We look like idiots, but
no, not because of that. Not because of that. Yeah, maybe it's my own. It's because I'm more of a morning person. So
maybe.
Should have eaten the frog earlier. Yeah.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you.